Hello, my name is Mike Earl, and in this series of videos I want to talk with you about an idea that I've been thinking about for many years, something I like to call the outside first hypothesis. The outside first hypothesis is the first premise of an argument that I'll be constructing for the purpose of justifying a particular philosophical system. Now, by philosophical system, I mean a coherent set of ideas designed to inform every area of human concern. These ideas constitute a system in that all of them ultimately derive from the same set of first principles. And it's this set of first principles I will attempt to justify with an argument. The first premise of this argument is the outside first hypothesis. So what is the outside first hypothesis? The outside first hypothesis is a proposition about the way human beings interpret visual experience. Specifically, it's the proposition that a human being will believe that what he sees is located outside of his head before he will believe it is located inside of his head. Let me say that again. The outside first hypothesis is the proposition that a human being will believe that what he sees is located outside of his head before he will believe it is located inside of his head. And this is the case for all human beings, regardless of time or place. All people will believe outside first. Here's another way to think about it. As I consider the visual experience I'm having right now, it seems that what I see here is located outside of my head, and I am seeing it from a vantage point located inside of my head. It's almost like I'm sitting inside a cave and looking out of the cave through the cave's entrance. So it seems like I am looking out of my head and into a three-dimensional world, which is outside of my head. That is how things seem. But is this right? Is the way things seem the way things are? No, according to the science. According to the science, what I see is not a three-dimensional world located outside of my head, but rather a two-dimensional retinal image located inside my head. What I'm seeing right now, for all intents and purposes, is not the world outside of my head, but the backs of my eyeballs inside my head. Now this is not obvious, but that's the science. The science notwithstanding, which of these scenarios, outside versus inside, do you think I'm going to believe first? I'm going to believe outside first. Why? Because it seems like it's outside, and it doesn't seem like it's inside. So I'm going to believe outside first, even though it's wrong. The outside first hypothesis simply says that what is true for me is true for everyone. All people will believe that what they see is located outside of their heads before they will believe it's inside. The outside first hypothesis can be thought of as a special case of a more general principle which says that people will believe ideas consistent with the way things seem before they will believe alternative ideas that are not obvious. This more general principle explains why people believed in a flat earth before they believed in a round earth. It explains why people believed in geocentrism before they believed in heliocentrism. It explains why people believed in creationism before they believed in evolution. In each of these cases, people believed the one idea before the other because the first idea was consistent with the way things seemed and the second idea was not. The outside first hypothesis is this same idea applied to visual experience. We believe that what we see is located outside of our heads before we believe it's inside because the outside scenario agrees with the way things seem and the inside scenario does not. As I mentioned earlier, the outside first hypothesis is the first premise of an argument. And by premise, I simply mean a working assumption. We're going to assume the outside first hypothesis is true for the sake of argument. Now, is it true? I suspect it probably is. But even if it isn't true, in these videos, we're going to follow a line of reasoning that assumes it is. So the outside first hypothesis is our first premise. and is probably our most important premise. Let's move on to our second premise. The second premise says that the outside scenario and the inside scenario are mutually exclusive. They represent incompatible ways of understanding the same visual experience. Because they are mutually exclusive, they cannot both be right. And that's the most important point of this second premise. Whichever scenario is right, the other is wrong, and completely wrong. So that's our second premise, that the outside scenario and the inside scenario are mutually exclusive. Let's move on now to our third premise. The third premise says that the outside scenario is wrong and the inside scenario is right. Now, the outside first hypothesis, which is our first premise, does not say which of our two scenarios is correct. It only says that we will believe the outside scenario first. Our third premise is a kind of judgment, and it says that the outside scenario is wrong and the inside scenario is right. That's the third premise. The fourth premise describes a person's initial disposition toward the outside scenario, which is the one we believe first. The fourth premise says that the outside scenario is initially experienced as a transparent assumption. The idea here is that prior to a person's learning that the outside scenario might be wrong, it would not even occur to that person that it could be wrong. Initially, the outside scenario is not even thought of as an interpretation. Initially, the outside scenario is uncritically embraced as an obvious fact, even though it's wrong. This is what I mean when I say that the outside scenario is initially experienced as a transparent assumption. Let's quickly review what we've covered so far. So far, our argument consists of four premises. Premise number one says that the outside first hypothesis is correct. In other words, all people will believe that what they see is located outside of their heads before they will believe it is located inside of their heads. Premise number two says that the outside scenario and the inside scenario are mutually exclusive ways of understanding the same visual experience. Premise number three says that the outside scenario is wrong and the inside scenario is right. And premise number four says that the outside scenario is initially experienced as a transparent assumption. So this is how the argument begins, and there's much more to follow. But I want to pause here to point out something. Based on just these four premises alone, we can draw a conclusion. And it's a fairly radical conclusion. Specifically, if these four premises are true, then it follows that all of us, without exception, begin our journeys through life with a categorically mistaken belief about what we think we see. This mistake is radical in that it's a mistake that everyone makes, it's a mistake that is categorical in nature, it's a mistake that initially we are completely unaware of, and it's a mistake about what is arguably our most dominant physical sense, visual experience. Now, as radical as this may seem, I'm going to argue that our mistake is even more radical than this. Because the mistake we make, the mistake all of us make, is about far more than just visual experience. In the next video, we will consider this much larger mistake. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.